So I would like to welcome everyone to season 3 of the Stockbridge Library, Museum and Archives online poetry series. We are starting our 3rd year. And this season, our theme is inquiry and the power of questions and exploring inquiry through poetry. And this whole series was introduced to the Stockbridge Library from the very brilliant idea of John Gillespie, who at the time was the president of the Board of Trustees of the Stockbridge Library, and he helped us get through the pandemic in many ways, one of which was having this great idea to bring poetry, a little lunchtime poetry to everyone. And today we are lucky to have a poet with us who has not read for us before, David O'Connell. And David's first full-length collection, Our Best Defense, was published by Cervena Barva Press, and that was this year in 2022. David's poetry has appeared in the Cincinnati Review, New Ohio Review, Copper Nickel, Tar River Poetry, and the North American Review, among other journals. And his chapbook, A Better Way to Fall, was awarded the Philbrook Poetry Award from the Providence Athenaeum. David, so happy to have you here with us today. And without further ado, I turn the program over to you, John, and you, David. Thank you.
Yeah, Wendy, thanks a lot. Thanks for hosting. Yeah, and David, I didn't tell you, we lived in Cincinnati for 2 years. My wife and I, and our son was born there. So my wife went to the University of Cincinnati for a while. So we'll probably have to hear about the Cincinnati, Ohio connection maybe later on. So, we start with, really trying to play out the theme. What does inquiry really mean to you? It could be in your work, it just could be in life itself. What does that inquiry or the power of questions mean for you?
Well, I just wanted to start by saying, Wendy and John, thank you so much for having me and the library for this wonderful series. And I love this topic. John, you and I had spoken about it just briefly earlier in the week, and since then it's been I've been mulling it over. And I realized that right from the beginning of my understanding of poetry and my sort of interest in poetry, it also came with poems that were steeped in inquiry. I know it gets a bad rap, but when I was in middle school, we had to memorize poems and recite them. And the first poem I ever remember doing that with was Robert Frost's Stopping by Woods in a Snowy Evening, and which starts like, whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village though. And this whole idea of he's not sure, and he's sharing that idea of not being sure, and then he sort of brings us into these woods that of course in the end are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, the famous lines. But a lot of poems early on that I was interested in were poems where it seemed like the poet was mulling over something or exploring something through the poem, and then inviting the reader to share in that as well. And so everything from Frank O'Hara's Why I'm Not a Painter. I mean, that's this great New York School poem that starts, why am I not a painter? I'm a poet, and then he goes on to kind of investigate that. I remember like Robert Hayden's poem, like, what did I know at the end? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? That very famous poem. So over and over, it's these poems where in some ways the poet throws up their hands a little bit and says, I don't know the answer to this, but I'm going to share my process of investigating it with you, that I've always really liked. And I think that poems themselves are a great medium for that, because they often allow us to kind of think through the art itself in a way that maybe some others don't allow as easily. I don't know, that's debatable, but certainly poems can do that.
Great. So has that inquiry showed up in your work?
I think it has. I mean, the whole process of putting together the book, I think, was one of inquiry. Like, I think putting together your first collection is really odd because for me, it was more than a decade's worth of work, and a lot of work, and more than, I'd say, 2/3 of the stuff got left on the cutting room floor by the time it gets put together into the book. And when you first start sending it out, there's this constant reshuffling of putting stuff in and taking other things out. So in part, putting together a collection is an inquiry of like, what is the larger theme here? What are the larger questions here? What am I asking the reader to participate in here? And it's so different between writing a single poem where you just focus on that one thing. And that's what's so nice often about poems, is like, you don't have to care about what you did last week or the month before. You're working on whatever you're working on right there, as opposed to a novel or even a short story. But then putting together the collection, all of a sudden you're responsible for this big pile, and then you've got to organize it and try to figure out a way that they make sense together. So
how did that, no, it sounds like a really engaging process. So was there a theme or a direction that emerged as you were assembling that?
yeah, I would say that there wasn't sort of one theme exactly, but some of the poems I'm going to read today, I think I started noticing myself continually sort of asking questions about like returning to the idea of pop culture and fame in different ways, returning to the ideas of sort of the things that are facing this world that are going to be facing my daughter in 20 years that maybe aren't facing my generation quite as much. We're causing them. And I realized that poems coming at it from different angles. I was kind of almost thinking about it as chess. I'm sure we've all seen like I'm not a chess aficionado by any means, but we've probably all seen like the cheating scandal that's going on lately, and it's been popping up in the newspaper. So I try to like figure out like what is happening there. But one of the things I was really interested when I was reading about it and thinking about it in terms of this is how when a poet sets out with a question, they have certain strategies. Certain strategies work, like asking the reader a question is a strategy, like taking on a persona is a strategy, using a form is a strategy. But just like how chess has certain strategies, but eventually you get to move, I don't know, 27 or 55 or something, and they say it's suddenly a new game, like it's never been played before, like it's never been quite this way. And I think that happens with poems as well, that you start out with a strategy, and if they work, eventually they sort of lead you to a place of newness and of invention where you're discovering. You're not just inquiring, you're also discovering.
Wow. So it seems like, there's a life beyond the poems themselves as they kind of collaborate and move you into a new direction. Yeah, really interesting.
I think so, yeah.
So you like to read some of your work for us?
Absolutely. So the first poem I'm going to read is actually the first poem in the book. And the book is Our Best Defense, which was published just this year by Cervena Barra Press. And this first poem really does focus on what I was saying a little bit about sort of fame and pop culture and our obsession with it, including myself. I don't not include myself among those who are obsessed with it. So it's called Seeing the Famous, Our Desire for Fame. And there are questions for the reader at the end, which is one of the reasons I selected this one. Seeing the famous, our desire for fame flares up. Match, gas. We are so lonely. This is the reason we dream of soirees of the famous, long for the static electricity of rubbed shoulders, the struck tuning fork of ice in crystal tumblers, punctuating the anecdote of an ingenue, empty calories, intoxicating. Seeing the famous, our desire to make it through this life widens like a curtain on a minimalist set. One chair, a table, one lamp. We know enough to expect an intermission. A cigarette can be an island in the Pacific. A drink can be a drink. It's then with our companions that we discuss the famous of film and television we've seen on stage. Go, warm your hands over the little conversations concerning the famous like love, a universal language. It's clear they have something. What is it? I'm asking you, who's seeing the famous think autograph, but act insouciant. Yes, yes, at the next table. Did you see them? Tell us about the time. It's passing so quickly.
Very interesting.
Thank
Yeah.
you. The second, should I just sort of read the first couple that I
Yeah.
have, or would you want to
Yeah,
pause and talk about
I
them?
think also, if you have some, context of, how the poem, arrived, or a little background on the poem, we always like some color
Sure.
commentary, if that gives us some insight to, I've had some, like Perry, we've had so many, family poets. I feel like I know some family trees from 2 or 3 families. Grandma Jane did this, and I don't know, she was smoking a cigar on the back porch when the car went through the roof, So no, it's always good, like the background just, I think, helps us put
Sure.
the poem in a little different, if you can share stuff.
Sure. That poem actually, it was one of those poems that comes to you in sort of a flash. There are those that you kind of work through, you know exactly where they come from. I do think sometimes the best ones just sort of arrive, and that one kind of did. But the second poem that I'm reading, I can tell you exactly where it came from. It was from an episode of Seinfeld, and there's a line in the episode where they're sitting in the coffee shop, and there are these waitresses walking around, and the Seinfeld character says, "I've never seen women collected like this outside of a Russ Meyer film." And
That's a good reference. Yeah.
Yeah, well, exactly. And for a second, I mean, it's a little before my time, and I was thinking, Russ Meyer, who is that? And then I realized, oh yeah, he's like the director of these B movie pictures.
Yeah, the B movie
And I was
guy. Yeah.
realizing that like he survived in some ways, like through this massively popular show. A lot of people were hearing his name because of what he did. He becomes this reference, and it becomes like stages and stages and stages away from what he did, like what he created, as he sort of goes on. So this poem is called "What Are You Doing with Your Life?" I know the name Russ Meyer, that he was an American director of, I believe, B movie pictures featuring, and this is his mark, large-breasted women in various states of undress. But I've never seen one of his movies, or as far as I know, his photograph, and I'm not sure how he died, or the dates on his headstone, or to be honest, if he's even dead. But I know the name and caught the reference and the joke when Seinfeld, talking in a rerun to Elaine, drops it in a wisecrack about the waitresses in the coffee shop. I haven't seen 4 women like this together outside of a Russ Meyer film, which got me thinking, is this enough, or what Russ Meyer wanted? All that effort, so after you're dead, it rings a bell, your name, though over time, as if there's fur, more and more, lining the mouth of that bell.
Yeah, it's scary. I knew who Russ Meyer was right away. I've never seen one of his movies either, but it's just like one of those, you see his name on over a period of time on various things. So yeah.
Sure.
Nice.
And so one of the things I was finding in the poems, a number of them focusing kind of sideways on the climate condition, environmental disaster that's sort of ongoing, but less in a straight on the nose sort of fashion.
Yeah.
But I found that that was sort of percolating through a number of the poems. And this is a poem that I guess I started with all of these references, not to pop culture, but to some of those earliest stories like Ulysses and Aeneas and Gilgamesh that I had studied when I was in college and grad school, and how in all of these epic journeys, like everything always turns out okay. That no matter like what it is, it seems like more or less things turn out okay, at least for most of the story, for despite all the challenges these characters face. And I was thinking how in some ways our own stories maybe lull us into a complacency that somehow we're just going to pull ourselves out of yet another scrape, which we're in. And so again, it sort of asks the question, like, if that's not the case, if these stories in some way have led us down the wrong path, how do we find the right one? And it's called The Heroes Lead Us Down the Primrose Path. Yes, men die unspeakable deaths, but not brave Ulysses. And that Hulk Gilgamesh may lose Enkidu and suffer something we diagnose as clinical. But he gets over it, and so do we, stepping off for each fresh epic journey, confident whatever the monster, we'll skirt the stats that govern mere mortals. My point is, something here has drawn us into trouble. Or if not you and me, then my daughter sleeping in the next room, and your child, or your great, or great-great. And even Aeneas couldn't fight the weather. And even brave Achilles couldn't restore the Panamanian golden frog to its rapidly diminishing habitat. The truth is, there's a problem with our imaginations, one that's been climbing the rungs of our DNA like some dark Grendel from the chaos of our making since we first dropped down from the canopy. And how do we fight that? How do we trust we're not the hero, or even the tag-along born to sing his tale?
Yeah, I like the Dark Grendel reference.
Oh, thanks.
David White plays out that story in The Heart Aroused for, yeah. It's a great story about, going into the deep and facing your demon and then facing the demon's mother. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's like, I don't know. It's like one of those action movies. Hey, we won. Yeah. Then all of a sudden, 5 tanks appear on the hill. Oh, we're not done yet now.
Right. Part 2. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, part two. Yeah. Don't claim victory. And yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
No,
Great.
exactly.
That's good. That's good. That's a good one. Yeah.
The last one I was thinking of maybe in this sort of first section was just how form itself can be a form of inquiry and invite the reader into a form of inquiry. And there are, I think with a lot of people's first books, they end up going to forms as a way, as you're sort of in your apprenticeship, testing things out and trying different forms. And so though I've written, a handful of villanelles, there's one villanelle that found its way into the book. And the villanelle is a very interesting form if you're not familiar, because the first and the third lines keep on repeating at ends of stanzas, and then they repeat again. The very famous one is, do not go gentle into that good night, rage against the dying of the light, is that form. But so this one is much more close to home. It's called Once Around the Block, and it's about neighborhoods and how, as neighborhoods turn over or change. I live in a neighborhood that it seemed everybody sort of bought in the 1960s, and now is at this point where, you know, a lot of families are either moving or just as often, you know, passing away, and younger generations are coming in, and how even this area right outside the window there, if you could see, at one time that's now completely suburban was orchards, and before that fields, and you hear stories from old timers about what this used to be like in this area. So that all sort of makes its way into the form in the poem.
Yeah, in Providence, right? Providence?
Yep, North Providence. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So yeah, Fruit Hill is like right behind us. So once around the block, the neighborhood is slowly turning over. A flag across the street cracks like a slap. Empty streets are crowded now with strollers. Once this was all orchard, before that clover. Now weekend joggers wave with every lap. The neighborhood is slowly turning over. Mortgages balloon, then plummet underwater. This oak had held for 50 years, then snap. Empty streets are crowded now with strollers. Take the Bratton place, its family's era over, bought for a song to renovate and flip. The neighborhood is slowly turning over. Morning brings the movers, noise, those neighbors scouting out the ones who filled the gap. Empty streets are crowded now with strollers. And so another generation's come to collar what was here when here was nowhere on the map. The neighborhood is slowly turning over. Empty streets are crowded now with strollers.
So give me your sense of that. You know, turnover seems like a natural condition or evolution but I guess sometimes it's the past gets swept away with it.
Yeah, well, I think it is kind of funny because the form and the repetition and the rhythm, because it's, you know, it's that iambic rhythm.
Yeah.
It makes it seem much darker than if you had just said it once elsewhere. Like, the neighborhood is crowded now with strollers. Seems like great. It's new life, and it's like babies and kids, and everything is, you know, coming up roses in some way. But the poem, by insisting on it and having it repeat over and over, it was one of those things maybe that's a little surprising to me. I mean, part of it is it's always this negotiation between what you intend and then what sort of just kind of starts happening, especially with a form like that. Like, once you set those first 3 lines and you have to repeat them, you're not quite sure how it's going to sound by the end. But it does sound like much darker than it seems like it should. And I feel like that's why, to me, the villanelle kind of works better than maybe other villanelles I wrote, is because there is this weird tension of, well, why is that a bad thing? But why does it sound like a bad thing? Is the speaker saying it? And so that's that inquiry, I guess, that I was thinking about why I chose it, is that the audience is left going, do I agree that this is at all menacing or dark or terrible? Is it not? I don't know. And I feel like the reader is left to kind of ask maybe the questions that you were asking. Like, you know, like, what do I think of that?
Well, my sense was, I think when I heard it the third time, man, there's got to be 50 strollers in the neighborhood.
Sure.
He keeps talking about it. There's no pedestrians on the street because there's too many strollers. I was trying to, like, you know, I'm a finance guy, so I was like trying to do the math in my head. How many strollers could be in the neighborhood?
In a poem, probably an infinite amount.
Yeah, probably, yeah. There's no room. There's no room for a moving truck because they can't get through the strollers. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, oh boy.
But I think a little bit is the idea in the poem is that at the end, another generation's come to collar what was here when here was nowhere on the map. I think that there's always this sense of hearkening back to kind of like a yesteryear. And even when I hear people talk about this area and how idyllic it once was, like before any houses were here, that I think that finds its way a little bit, that we all, especially as things become a little busier and more chaotic and whatever, there's a sense of, gosh, weren't things simpler back in the day? Like, weren't they somehow like better back in the day? Like, and so maybe the poem is kind of wrestling with that a little bit as well.
Yeah, I took my my son-in-law to the Bruins game on Saturday, so we drove, I don't know, about 2+ hours from Midcoast, Maine down to Boston, and I hadn't been there in about 6 years, and I swear it all looks different. There is almost nothing that looks the same. The bars have changed. This, I guess, North Station is still North Station, but for me, it's not about trying to remember the past. It's just this disorientation of being in a geography and not knowing, not having any GPS. Like, what is this now? You know? Yeah.
No, I think that's really well put, that idea of disorientation over time and not knowing a geography. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Michael or Perry, we have a chance to ask some questions. As I say, we don't want to let the poet off easy. Want to make sure we're, Perry, we're putting him on the rack and stretching him out, getting all those questions out of him. So yeah, Perry's laughing. Don't do that to me in February. Don't try that with me. So Michael or Perry, you have any questions?
I'll go ahead and jump in. And David, thanks for reading. I'm really appreciating your poems, and I agree about the villanelle, and it does leave us with a darker feeling, and the whole the idea about the turning over of a neighborhood. You know, a lot of, I mean, it's sometimes heartbreaking to think about it. You know, what was the original neighborhood, and maybe, you know, who's the last original neighborhood mother left in the neighborhood, and for that mother, you know, it's the strollers. It's changed over completely. So I think it's very well done, and I liked what you said about you know, first books and themes, and just really how the first poem kind of sets up that narrator, that first person, as, for me, almost starting to kind of take me on a trip. And I appreciate that. It makes me want to continue, and I think it was just a wonderful way to start your collection. And just about, you know, time passing quickly with the setup in your first poem. It's, you know, you're just reinforcing that in the villanelle too. And I'm intrigued about your collection, and if, did you also experiment with different forms in your first book, as just a kind of a way to kind of show your, you know, your mastery over the forms? And that's interesting to me. I hadn't thought about first books in that way before, but yeah, I appreciated that. I'll stop
Thank you
because I
so-
get a gazillion questions, but
I really,
No, I really,
go ahead.
I really
Sorry.
appreciate the way that you noted the connection between the villanelle and the first poem, because I didn't mention that about the villanelle, but that actually was the first and last poem in the first section, and they sort of bookend each other a little bit.
Nice.
No, I thank you so much. I appreciate your comments.
yeah,
I
nice.
think a villanelle is usually always, because of the repetition, it's always sort of haunting. You know, it's like Elizabeth Bishop or Retke. You know, it just sounds like that. And I think you did it really, really well. I like when you talked about form and how important it is. You know, I've talked to John a lot about, when I'm stuck writing, I go to form. I write something in form, a villanelle, something, you know, an iambic pentameter, something, you know, more structured, and that seems to loosen things up for me. I think it's one, and you know, I don't write in form usually because it's really hard, I think. It's really hard to pull it off without sounding goofy, but I think you do it really, really well. And then, you know, you got to go right back to the beginning where you said, Stopping by Woods. The only poem I've ever memorized in my life is Stopping by Woods. The only poem, not even my own,
Yeah.
because of the rhythm. You know? And it's so wonderful. And nobody did it better than Frost, in my opinion. You know, because the poem, the content is reflected in the form. I mean, the guy's riding a horse. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. Who does that? I mean, I can't do that. You know, that's so good. So anyway, I'm just rambling, but I really do appreciate form and someone who can write in form like you do. It's hard. It's hard.
Absolutely. And I wouldn't want to give the wrong impression. I think of the whole book, there's
Mhm.
maybe, you know, there's just a handful of poems in
Sure,
form, because I
sure.
totally agree with what you're saying. Like, I go to form sometimes when I'm stuck and I find it very challenging. And to be honest, like I said, about throwing away a lot of villanelles, I write a deal in form, but most of it will end up on the cutting room floor. You know,
Yeah,
in some ways
yeah.
it like keeps you writing and it keeps you
Mhm.
moving forward, but it's rare that I feel like, oh,
Yeah,
this works well
me
enough that
too,
it's
me
gonna,
too. And
yeah.
I think it's because it's hard. I mean, it's hard for me. It's hard to make it sound, it's hard to make rhyme and form sound not goofy. I guess, you know, I just do it and I go, that's so, what are you sitting there trying to, let's see, go and no, and so and flow. It just sounds so forced, you know, I guess is the word for me. But once in
It
a
can,
while,
yeah, absolutely.
once in a while it takes off and it's so great. It's so great, but it's hard. It's really
Oh
hard.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And when
So
it's done
Perry,
well, it's so
Yeah.
fantastic. Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
I remember, memorizing poems. I don't know if that was the standard staple of 8th grade or 7th grade, but I will never forget the lines from Barbara Frietchie by John Greenleaf Whittier. Shoot if you must this old gray head, but spare your country's flag, she said. You know, it was
Wow.
the Confederate soldiers came into town, and one of the shoulder, she was waving a an American flag at the time out of her window, and the Confederate soldiers shot it. I guess it split the rod in half, and she grabbed the flag and she yelled that out. Now it's funny. So I did some research on this, and the story was attributed to Barbara Frietchie, but was really not Barbara Frietchie.
Huh.
It's amazing. There's a whole, I don't know, there's a whole little historical story that was, I don't know.
I can remember why I learned Stopping by Woods. You know, it was Frost reading at Kennedy's inauguration. He didn't read Stopping by Woods. He read The Gift outright. But that got my interest going. Was about 9, 10, I guess.
Yeah,
About 10 years old.
yeah, nice. So, David, let's regroup a bit. So, do you have any of those inquiry poems available that from those other poets you talked about? If you don't have them handy, I know you referenced them early as a great example. So don't dig them out. I mean, it'd be nice to, if you had them, just to share those, but don't worry about that.
No, but I mean, they're easily found online. Yeah. Such as Why Am I Not a Painter by Frank O'Hara is a fantastic one. There's The Waiting Room by Elizabeth Bishop is a fantastic one where she sort of exclaims in the middle, you were an Elizabeth, like, why should I be one too? I'm badly paraphrasing there. I think I had mentioned, of course, the Frost poem and the Robert Hayden poem. Oh my gosh, is that those winter Sunday mornings or those winter mornings? Gosh, how can I not remember the title? But I remember the end.
I think it
But
is
those are all.
those winter Sundays.
That's
think.
it. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
So Davis, just share a little bit. I mean, we did more of this probably in season one, but some things about your creative process. Is it kind of spontaneous, or is it other people like to be in a locked room at 8 o'clock in the morning or 5 a.m. and they can't come out until there's 400 words written down or something.
Right.
So that's probably Julie. Julie is probably like, no kidding. His wife is read for us. She's going to read for us in a few weeks. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely changed over the years. Like Julie and I actually met in the Ohio State University MFA program, which is that's my closest to a Cincinnati connection.
Yeah.
And just living in that area. And for many years, I was a high school teacher, and I found that during that time, writing was more spotty. This was after graduating from the MFA program, and it was difficult to find those moments, and so it was a little bit more all over the place. And then when our daughter was born, I stayed home with her, and that really changed my writing process. And so now I really do try to write most mornings. The one thing that has changed is that now I work at home, and I don't like to write in the same place where I work, like the same study at the same computer. So I actually bought a laptop and just sit on the couch and write in the morning on a laptop, just because there's something that's a little overwhelming about always being in the same space all day for work and for writing.
And then what do you do work-wise?
So I'm a editor and sort of write communications and edit for a company that does trainings for pharmaceuticals, for pharmaceutical companies. So
yeah, and it's funny you talk about writing spaces, because in one of the David White audios, he talked about he wrote in his house in Bainbridge Island, Washington. He wrote 5 books at 5 different locations, and as he was writing his 6th book, he didn't know if he could go back and use a prior location inside the house to write the next book. But yeah, no, just I don't know I don't know if it's just superstition. You have a place that gives you inspiration, and that's where you go.
I think mine was just more physical. I don't know how many people are working at home that are on the call right now, but I know, like, when you're working at home and you leave the house less and you sort of get up and find yourself like sitting down in that same space that you work, it's literally, if you want to feel creative and imaginative, just like getting somewhere else. I'm not too, I don't concern myself about where I take the laptop and write, but it's just like, I just don't want to be in basically my cubicle, which is, my home office space. So.
Cool. So do you have some more poems to share with us?
I do. So I guess the second group of poems, I was thinking a lot about inquiry as sort of the questions. I think all the poems that I read in the first part either asked an explicit question, or like the Villanelle kind of asked the question of the reader. But the second group of poems that I selected, I was thinking much more how what you had said, that I guess that Emily Perez had said, that the poem engages in a search. And that kind of led me to think of other poems that I grouped in the book about engaging in a search, starting with something and then kind of working it over and trying to figure something out about it. And so oftentimes I like when a poem starts with something very sort of obvious or common and then makes us see it in a new way. And so that's maybe my strategy in these poems. And in the first one, it's in the movies, one rarely dies alone. And the sort of impetus for this one was simply the idea that realizing that when you're watching a movie, almost always when a character dies, I may have watched a character die, as first idea that came to me, you see them speaking to someone else, like in their death throes, like they could be riddled with bullets, they could be delirious with fever, but they still are able to kind of have that last speech, and how in some ways unrealistic that was. And then it kind of made me think a little bit about those old frescoes that you see of the angels kind of watching over characters, sometimes in their moments of death, and how when we're in theaters, in some ways, we're like those angels in some way, like we're watching over what happened. So even when that character is alone, they're not really alone. And it kind of plays with that idea, hopefully in a humorous way, and then it kind of turns towards the end. In the movies, one rarely dies alone. In the movies, one rarely dies alone. Usually someone is scripted in, giving the dying a reason to speak, so we might be moved by the improbable last words delivered raspingly or between blood coughs, causing considerable squinching up of eyes. And even when someone dies alone, he or she is not alone. We know that every death is attended to by a union crew, and it's a work day where even the dead are on the clock. True, we may forget more easily if the one dying is particularly deft at suffering, having died many deaths. But also somewhere we remember that there is a reality behind this reality on screen, even as we grieve in the refrigerated dark amongst the gathered strangers, shoulder to shoulder in comfortable rows. All of us there with the dying, the way in some frescoes, the angels bear witness, forbidden to intervene.
An interesting concept. Yeah. Yeah.
So the next one, when the book came out in the spring, and you hear from family and friends and others that have read the book, there was one poem that was literally mentioned in every email, letter, phone conversation, which is this poem on marital strife. And it's funny, my wife is going to be reading in this series in a couple of weeks. It was not her favorite poem as I was putting this book together. It's not about any particular incident, but just the way in which we have arguments. We as in human beings have arguments, and how, again, starting with a common thing, having arguments, but how the idea was, in the inquiry, was a little bit like, it's really our stories that are having arguments, the way in which each of us see something, and how it's the stories that are sort of battling it out. But I guess it rings a bell. Other people would say like, oh yeah, that's exactly how it is in my relationship as well. So this is called On Marital Strife. And it's not that my wife hates the poem, but it definitely wasn't one of her favorites, although she's come around as she's heard all these comments. Because I wasn't sure that I was right, but was sure I wanted to be right, I told you a story to persuade us, as you told me a story to persuade us, so that it wasn't so much us, but our stories arguing in the kitchen after dinner, that you should accept our lives are this, or I should agree our lives are that. Each story as night came on, propelling us like a wave or a bull. And whether in these cases a story wins out because it's better told, or whether it succeeds because in fact it's true, is another story. As is this version I'm writing now, hoping I suppose someone else, or many others, will read this long after we've forgotten everything and agree with me that this too is the way it is with them and their stories, though they do not know you or me or the nature of the argument we had last night for hours, our stories revising themselves until more or less there was a version we could live with. And then we went to sleep.
Yeah, interesting concepts.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So one of the things also I was thinking with inquiry a little bit is metaphor as inquiry. Like whenever you compare one thing to another, in some ways, both you're asking, is this like that? And then if it resonates with the reader is making that connection where they're saying like, how is A like B? And then that spark goes up and they're like, oh my gosh, yeah, A is like B. And there's that moment of, I think it's one of the great pleasures of poetry. There's that moment of recognition that someone has when they inquire into the metaphor and then, get their response from it. So this next poem is about hostas, which were planted here before we ever moved in, that line our house. I didn't even know what the plants were called when, I know they're very common, but not a gardener. And, seeing the hostas over the years and how every August they shoot up these sort of the stalks and the flowers come out. And that's when the bees come and they pollinate. And then every year they sort of die out completely and we rake them out and there's just these sort of mounds and then they come back the next year. So in some ways, this was trying to make a very commonplace plant into something new through metaphor and that kind of inquiry. It's called the hostas. The hostas line our house and back like sentries, squat, glum through the long summer when they are all leaf, mouths of many tongues catching rain. August, and they up periscope 2-foot stalks, straining on tiptoe to outdo their neighbors. Then flowers along each stalk, spaced like a fisherman's trot line, their buds wrapped tight as dolls' parasols, until sprung by sun, they unfurl, 6-petaled, belled, the pale violet of a bridesmaid's gown. Days they advertise, and the bees oblige, while the lithe stalks nod over and over, the season waning, the well-loved bloom soon tattered, as streamers in the rafters weeks past the dance. Come frost, and the dry stalks topple, the thinned leaves wither on the crown. Planted before our time, we tend to them, in part for those who will be here after. November, and nothing's left but the summer's embers in the root shag, banked against the cold's long siege.
Nice. Very nice.
Thank you. And I selected just one more. I figured after the marital strife poem, I would end with a poem sort of praising my wife, who is wonderful and whose book is wonderful. I hope everybody's able to attend in a couple of weeks when she's reading in December. Julie Danho. And this is a poem that I wrote, I started while I was actually still teaching high school, and it references that. But again, this pulls in some of the interest in pop culture that I had shown earlier, but also these other poems where I take something very commonplace, and here it's certain tropes from movies that we see over and over, and try to investigate it, sometimes with humor, sometimes making us see it in a little new way, and ultimately maybe see my relationship in a new way that's maybe not Hollywood, but is more authentic. And it's called After Another Biopic. And I just wanted to say, once again, this has been such a pleasure. It's been so nice to be able to read for you all and to be invited. So I really appreciate it, John.
Yeah, no.
And Wendy for hosting it.
No, great to have you.
After Another Biopic. If this is a film-worthy marriage, we're in for trouble. That tight shot, maybe, where I wince shut the door, hush, hush the caller. Or the hour your fix cuts our first rush bliss to ribbons, until at last my love miracles the needle from your arm. But maybe this isn't that movie at all, and the plot just thickens round my middle, till I'm that 60-ish Irish knit comb over you gaze on fondly, because I'm saying something really tear-jerking, As side by side, the post-production bird song teeming, we fly cast for rainbows, lots of panorama, lots of vista. Or maybe that's all opening credits, and we're more gorgeous than we really are. And I'm clueless you're an agent until I come to in the chase scene as you leave the mafioso midair, slow-mo, and without reason, boom. Truth is, most days, I'm your too brief cameo peck, stepping off to teach romantics, daydreaming some kids living that school day soundtrack montage, promising hard streets overcome, adversity transcended. Cut to the carnival at night, the neon sunburst Ferris wheel where that poor boy sees his future, the mayor's only daughter, rising from the midway to the stars. His struggle through this formula, just beginning. Even as right now, you, my love, and I are so far from the story that no one but me listens for your breath. Blessedly familiar, routine, as you lie asleep beside me, and nothing whatsoever happens. Thanks.
Very nice. So we got just a couple minutes left. If Michael or Perry, I don't know. I don't know if our mystery iPhone person is Julie, so I won't. So Perry or Michael, if you have any comments or questions before we sign off this week.
Oh, just it's a pleasure to hear your poems, David.
Thank you.
Appreciated the opportunity to listen, and just I love the voice. I love the voice in your poetry. It carries the story, and that's important. That's excellent stuff. Thank you.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, David. It was really good. I have to say that the one poem about oh God, it was probably second to last, was so good. About the argument and then the two stories and how they come together, and then finally the story changes enough that you can go to sleep. So good. What a great idea.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
And I
Yeah,
think David,
I'll add you to the column that will that poem was flagged. Really, honestly, like siblings, friends, family, everybody. That's the one that they always would include. Like, oh yeah, and that one. So I guess everybody has that experience. Yeah.
well, I think it meant to me is that if I got to talk about something important with my wife, I ought to have a plan B story in my pocket. If plan A is not the flag's not flying on plan A, I might want to pull out plan B and see if yeah. No, it's great. No, it's story. You're right. No, it just makes me not, husband, wife, but business and stuff. It's like people are talking like this when they're meaning this. And I don't know. Why don't you two stories work it out and we'll come back after lunch and make a deal.
Right.
Yeah. No, David, thanks again. A great hour, and no, just fantastic. Thank you. Congratulations on your first book.
Thank you so much.
And I'm sure Julie will be providing commentary on December 6th. So we'll get the other side of marital bliss, grief, for storytelling. We'll get that.
I know she's going after me. I don't know that I probably wasn't wise. Like she
No.
gets to have the final word.
I think no.
It's the last
Julie,
word.
inside joke. Julie only goes after you if she's sitting on a bus. So you're good, David. I think you're good. It's one of Julie's poems. So you're good right now. Just don't be on the sidewalk. That's the key.
Right.
Yeah.
David, thank you so much. That was amazing.
Thank you.
poetry is really beautiful and great to listen to. Very moving. So glad you could join us today. I expect we'll at least see you in a square when Julie reads.
Definitely.
But do come back when you can. We'll meet here each week at noon.
Yeah. Very good. Great.
Thank
Thanks
you,
again,
everyone.
David.
Wonderful. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Thanks,
right.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Take care,
Bye,
everybody.
everyone.